Okay, everybody. Today, I want to give a shout out to Omar Bradley, former mayor of Compton, Omar Bradley. Today's his birthday. Reggie Wright Jr. has called him out, talked about all kinds of crazy shit, and I wanted to address it. And how I'm going to start this is by first off talking to you about how I met Omar. I actually reached out to Tom Mesereau and I said to Tom, "Hey, I know you know Omar Bradley." And he goes, "Oh man, what a sad case that whole thing is." And I said, "Really? What do you know?" And he said, Omar's a really good guy. He told me about having to watch hundreds of hours of FBI surveillance tapes. And it's kind of crazy to me because, you know, Reggie is the one who turned the FBI onto Omar, saying he's corrupt. And Reggie, said that Omar tried to take a bribe from him, all this other crazy bullshit. So Tom told me that he watched hundreds of hours of surveillance tape from the FBI in the Pat Moore case, but they were trying to hem up Pat Moore and they were trying even harder to hem up Omar. And they kept pushing suitcases full of cash over to Omar. And Omar kept pushing those suitcases full of cash back to them, saying, "No, thank you. I don't want your money." And I heard, since then, many people tell me about trying to offer Omar bribes and him always saying, "Hey, why don't you build a weight room for my kids? Why don't you build a school? Why don't you build, something else that the community needed?" And he said, "I don't personally want your money." I said, "But our community needs your money, and this is how you can help." And he would come up with a way that they could help that benefited the community. And in the case of Suge Knight, he actually had Suge write a check to the city of Compton for the weight room at Centennial High School. So Omar never took bribes. And so this thing that Reggie said about Omar taking bribes is a bunch of motherfucking bullshit. And how we know that is through Tom Mesereau. He actually, and you can see it on my channel. I have a video of Tom Mesereau talking about this that I've put up on the channel. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about Gary Beverly, because Gary is kind of the Rosetta Stone of the Tupac and Biggie murders, if you will. Because we learn a lot from those murders that help us solve the Gary Beverly murder. But the Gary Beverly murder also helps us solve the Tupac and Biggie murders. And as a documentary filmmaker, it is my mission to relentlessly pursue the truth. And those of you that have been following my work know that this has led me to Compton. And Compton is unlike any other city, with Crips and Bloods checkering the 10 square miles of the city. And then you add to that a known corrupt police department. And what do you have? You've got a recipe for disaster. And the known corrupt Compton Police Department, and I can only tell you about what I know about it. Russell Poole and many other LAPD cops that I talked to never wanted to give Compton PD any of their information because they knew it was just going to get right back to the people they didn't want that information going to, because the police department was so corrupt. But in the 7 years leading up to the disbandment of the corrupt Compton Police Department, there were 575 murders. And in the very last week of the Compton Police Department, before the vote occurred, there were 8 murders, one of which was Gary Beverly. And so this is 4 times the murder rate in Los Angeles County, and that alone was cause for concern. But then there's a weapon that should have been in the Compton Police Department's evidence locker that flows through death row records and is used to shoot Officer Brian Watt, who was a Long Beach police officer, and he was shot June the 9th of 1997. Now, one day the feds come over to Omar, and they knock on his door, and they say, "Hey, Omar, you're either stupid or you're in on it." And Omar says, "I'm stupid." And they said, "Hey, this gun flowed through your evidence locker. It flowed through death row records. It got on the streets, and it was used to shoot a cop. And we want that shit to stop." So Omar really had no choice but to investigate the corrupt Compton Police Department. And in the civil trial that Officer Brian Watt filed against the city of Compton and the Compton PD, both Reggie Wright Sr. and Reggie Wright Jr. had to give depositions about that gun and about how that gun made it onto the streets, flowing through death row records and the Compton PD evidence locker. And when you think about it, Reggie Wright Jr. is running death row records in 1997, and Reggie Wright Sr. is the head of gangs, and he controls all homicide investigations in Compton. So Omar says, "Hey, we're going to hire some people to do an investigation." He puts the chief and Percy Perrodin on administrative leave to start with, and the independent investigation finds kilos of cocaine in Horry Taylor's personal evidence locker, and there's kilos of cocaine missing out of the evidence locker, thousands and thousands of guns missing out of the evidence locker, PCP missing, thousands of pounds of marijuana missing. I think I said it. I think it was close to 100 kilos of cocaine missing out of the evidence locker. Now, this is similar behavior to what we had with the Rampart Scandal, and we know that the Rampart Scandal cops and the Reggies were all good friends. Those were friends of Reggie and Sharitha, and we hear that from Suge Knight. So now, simultaneous to this whole thing going on in the city of Compton, there's also a cemetery that's located at Central Avenue. And there's bodies that are being dumped in that cemetery. And in addition to the bodies being dumped, bodies that have been there for years are unearthed. And there's those remains that should be in the graves are pulled out, and those remains are intermingled with the remains of people that are being dumped in that cemetery. So there was nobody who could really sort out what was what in that cemetery with these bodies. And that was happening at the time that there's 575 murders in Compton. And the police were rumored in many cases to be doing the killing. They were operating as a cover-up operation instead of an investigating operation. And Reggie Wright Sr. is the one that's in charge of the investigations. So now if you doubt this is true, consider this. At the time that they were shut down, Compton PD had 275 unsolved murders. Compton Mayor Omar Bradley cited this number as significant at a city council meeting because as a murderer in Compton, you had a 50-50 chance of getting away with your murder. Now, once the sheriffs take over, the sheriff's detectives make it a point that they receive case files on 24 homicides. So let me say that again. 275 unsolved murders under the Compton PD. But the sheriffs say they only have 24 unsolved murder cases once they take over. So, what happened to the case files of the other 251 murders? Well, those case files never made it to the sheriffs that took over policing in Compton. And this tends to indicate that the Compton PD is a cover up operation. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the stakes in shutting down a police department, 251 murder files are purged before policing is turned over to the sheriffs. Why did they have to purge these files? Well, these files must have led to the crimes of sitting police officers. Criminals don't want to get caught, and these police did not want their racket to be shut down. They didn't want their cash flow to be interrupted because they're running drugs. Obviously, that's missing out of the evidence locker. They're running guns. Guns are missing out of the evidence locker. And they are running a murder for hire operation. And these murders, the unsolved ones, lead back to police officers. You look at Bobby Finch shot, I think there was a total of 13 shots that were fired. I think 12 or 11 hit his body, very tight pattern. He was killed by a cop. It's usually cops that can shoot that well. So, the city council meeting leading up to the vote to shut down the department became more and more heated. All of these meetings, right? There's a feasibility study that's done, and then they talk about it, and this goes on for a few years. And it rises to a fever pitch on June the 27th of 2000. There's an open public comment council meeting where former Compton police officer Eric Perrodin, and by the way, Eric, I mean, you've been stalking my Facebook page. I don't know why. I never mentioned you very much, but I'm going to mention you now. You were Reggie Wright Jr.'s patrol partner. You were financed by Reggie Wright Jr. under the guise of Death Row Records. Everybody blamed it for Suge, but Suge was in prison at the time. His campaign was being financed by Reggie Wright Jr. But Eric Perrodin was a former Compton police officer, and he was a sitting assistant district attorney at the time, and he gets done explaining why he thinks the Compton PD should not be shut down. He looks over at Omar, and he takes his thumb across his neck and makes a gesture that is a threat to the life of Omar Bradley. And many of you guys out there who know Omar, and full disclosure, Omar was the producer of my film Minnesota, the Modern Day Selma. So it's not like I'm not friends with Omar. I am very close friends with Omar. And so, disclosure of that conflict, but I also want you to know that as his friend and, having gotten to know him over this past decade, I know him as a man of integrity, and Tom Mesereau says he's a man of integrity, but I also know that Omar has a hot streak in him. And so when Eric Perrodin threatens Omar, I believe that it was a trap, and they were trying to lure him into some kind of bullshit where they were going to shoot him. And if they could kill Omar Bradley, the vote would have never happened, and the Compton PD would still be around today, most likely. Because nobody else would have stood up to the Compton PD. But Omar kind of lost his composure, and he threatened Eric Perrodin right back, telling him, "Do it now! Why wait?" And he started chasing Eric, and Eric started running. And what happened? Well, the Compton PD, who had showed up to intimidate the city council and Omar, were all wearing guns strapped like cowboys to their leg, open carry, so everybody could see their big old guns strapped. And when they stand up to support Eric Perrodin in his death threat against Omar Bradley, the firefighters all stand up to support the mayor and city council. Because don't forget the paramedics that were there. And I did talk to one of the paramedics who told me the killing was out of hand. They were tired of dealing with the dead bodies and they wanted peace on the streets. And so the firefighters all stood up to support the mayor. And the Crips and the Bloods had been deputized that night, and they were in attendance, and they also stood up. And the police realized that they were outnumbered. Now, the LA Times writer writes that Omar's men fled into the night, which is not the case, because I think the LA Times also was run by the power structures, and you needed a police department like the Compton PD where you could dump bodies into the cemetery and you could move the jurisdiction into an investigator who was going to cover shit up. And so the power structure really wanted to keep things going in Compton. And that's why the LA Times paints this in a negative light for Omar. So this happens. The police see that they're outnumbered. It doesn't spill to violence, and the police back down. So the very next day, Gary Beverly is murdered on the 91 freeway at the Wilmington exit during rush hour traffic at 4:45 p.m. as he left his job at Linwood Unified School District, and he was driving home in his Chrysler Sebring. This murder is unsolved to this day, and according to Compton police, there were no eyewitnesses and there was no evidence of a shooting. I.e., the shell casings were never found. Bullets, according to Compton PD, were never found. But the Compton mayor tells of visiting the morgue for the autopsy and seeing that the coroner had removed 2 bullets from the body of Gary Beverly. He also tells about an eyewitness to the murder who was intimidated by the Compton PD. And Gary Beverly and Omar Bradley worked together at the Linwood Unified School District, and they worked side by side. And many confused these men as they looked almost identical. It's likely that this was a case of mistaken identity, as the killers thought that their sights were set on Omar, but the case is classified as unsolved by the sheriffs to this day. And we have a death threat the night before, and then we have a murder the next day. And it's kind of a similar murder to the Tupac murder. This happens on the streets. This happens, in this case, on the 91 freeway. Probably use cell phones or radios to coordinate the hit. Probably multiple cars, spotters, what have you, kind of like what Frank Liga did to Kevin Gaines, where, there's traffic that's heard and it sounds like an assassination, as opposed to what Frank Liga said, where he just happened to get into road rage, which we all know sounds like bullshit. Sounds similar to what we know with Tupac's murder when we hear over a radio, "Got him," as Michael Moore has said. And there were cell phones that were being used in the Biggie murder to coordinate that hit. And so this is most likely a similar hit. And again, death threat the night before, next day is a murder. So I decided a week ago yesterday actually, to drive to Compton and go on a murder tour. And I was going to start at Linwood High School. And I can tell you this. I don't believe in coincidences, but I go by Linwood High School, where Gary Beverly was formerly the principal. And I get on Long Beach Boulevard, and 2 cars are in front of me. And those 2 cars pull off to the side of the road. And what's in front of me is a Chrysler Sebring. And that Chrysler Sebring gets onto the freeway just like Gary Beverly did 24 years ago. Now, I'm going to show you guys this video so you can see for yourselves, and this was just a random act of that car happening to be there. It's the wrong color, and I felt like, the universe was reaching down to me saying, hey, at least I gave you the right make of the car. You can change the color of the car in post-production. But I'll just say this to you, and hopefully we can learn things from the Gary Beverly murder that might help us with the other murders that we've investigated. Now, bullets are pulled out of Gary Beverly's body and they go missing. Where have we seen that before? Wait a minute. It was shell casings in Snoop's murder trial with Philip Waldemariam, where those shell casings go missing. And those shell casings in that murder would have showed that there were 2 guns. And both of those guns, by the way, go missing, and they never have to account for it. Now, there was an eyewitness to the murder, and that eyewitness is intimidated by Compton PD. And where have we seen that before? Well, it was the Rampart Scandal cops and the Compton PD cops that intimidated the witnesses in Snoop's murder. And those witnesses who were available and wanted to testify no longer wanted to testify, and in some cases were no longer available, and they were not testifying at Snoop's murder trial. Omar Bradley, in his book King of Compton, talks about right at the time Gary Beverly is murdered, Reggie Wright Sr. calls his phone, and when he answers, Reggie Wright Sr. says, "Oh, Omar, you're okay?" And Omar's like, "Yeah, why?" And then Reggie calls back 5 minutes later to tell him that Gary Beverly has been murdered, and wanting to know what kind of an alibi Omar has, because they're probably going to want to pin the murder on him. And we know from Michael Duro Sr. that Reggie Wright Sr. was having an affair with Michael Duro Sr.'s wife and pinned a murder on him to get him out of the way to continue the affair. So it's highly likely that they wanted to try and pin this murder on Omar Bradley, but were unable to. So, and the phone call, isn't that just like Kevin Hackey, who calls and talks to Reggie Wright Jr. right after Bobby Finch's murder and says, "Hey, Bobby Finch just got murdered." And Reggie goes, "Yeah, I already know." He goes, "What do you mean? This just happened a minute ago." He says, "Yeah, I already know." And Kevin Hackey says, "Hey, it must be because these guys are the ones that set it up." Right? So that's the Bobby Finch. And Bobby Finch was killed likely in a drive-by shooting. And you think about it, a cop that can shoot from the car and hit 11 or 12 rounds out of 13 into a body, that's pretty good shooting. Well, maybe it's the same shooter as the shooter that shot Bobby Finch. And we also know that the rumor was that the cops were involved in Vince Buchanan. And Vince Buchanan murder takes place at 135th and Central, and that's right across from Piru Street. And supposedly, somebody driving a police car picks up Vince Buchanan, handcuffs him, puts him in the car, and then drops him with bullets to his head at Greenleaf and Central, and his body is still handcuffed when he's dumped at Greenleaf and Central. And you've heard Reggie Wright Jr. talk about how, the rumors about him being involved in that murder. He says it himself. It's not something I'm making up. It's something he said himself. And of course, none of the witnesses really want to come forth in those murders, even though the rumors run rampant around Compton that the police, the Compton PD, were involved in the murder of Vince Buchanan. And then, of course, there's the murder of Buntry, who's driving for in Reggie Jr.'s vehicle. Supposedly Reggie Sr.'s there. And there we see Chuck Phillips play with the time. He moves the time back to the murder happening at 2:30 when the murder happens at 2 o'clock. And by then, Reggie Sr.'s got a airtight alibi. But that doesn't stop Cecil Rambo from calling him and saying, hey, where were you? You know, and wanting him to prove up that he had an alibi. And we hear that from Reggie Sr. And it's not something that we're making up. This is something that happened, and Reggie Sr. talks about it. So then there's the death threat the night before from Eric Perrodin, who's a former Compton PD. He's the riding partner, the patrol partner of Reggie Wright Jr. And let's not forget that Reggie Jr., through Death Row Records, funded Eric's campaign against Omar. And this is probably why Reggie Jr. has come out recently and said he hates Omar Bradley. Because don't forget, Omar Bradley shut down the corrupt Compton Police Department. And there is no statute of limitations on murder. And so any of these murders, the 251 case files that got purged, could come back to haunt anybody that was in that police department that was involved in those murders. So I just want to say one thing, and that's this. The very first murder that was documented in the Bible, God told Cain that the voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Now I believe that the blood of the innocent cry from the ground demanding justice, and that anyone who focuses on discovering the truth can invoke the help of the victims to make this truth bubble up so that we get help from the other side. And we just must simply remain focused on being relentless pursuers of the truth. And in the case of Gary Beverly, who by all accounts was an innocent, a man who did not deserve to die that day. They looked into his background. They couldn't find anything untoward in his background. And so this is a man who was innocent, and his blood cries out from the ground. And I want to give a shout out to Omar Bradley today, because he was brave enough to stand up to Eric Perrodin and to the corrupt Compton Police Department, and he was able to shut it down. And if we just look at the statistics of what happened the 7 years before, 575 murders, and in the 7 years after, 140, 150 murders, whatever it is, you know, there's 425, 450 people that are alive because of the actions and the courage of Mayor Omar Bradley, the only true mayor that Compton has ever had, the only true mayor that ever was really fighting for the people. Because of his courage in standing up to the corruption. And now I'm going to tell you straight up, he's a crazy fucker. There's no doubt about it. But because he's a crazy fucker, 400 and some odd people are alive today that would have been dead had the Compton PD continued. And it might have even been more, because things were spiraling out of control under the corrupt Compton PD. And I want to give a salute to former Mayor of Compton, Omar Bradley. More later.